Look, I've played a lot of deck builders. I've been obsessed with them since back when they were still mostly physical card games, and after seeing them make the jump to a digital medium, I've watched the genre explode into 1,000 wildly creative different forms that just weren't possible when they were physical cards. I've seen them mashed together with a tower defense, I've seen them combined with a tabletop RPG, I've seen them go more traditional and play like a TCG, and I've seen them modernized into something wholly their own thing. I've seen games play with every step of the deck building process, from how you acquire cards to how you play them, to all the many new mechanical layers of upgrades, deck management, and game-modifying items in between. I've seen them experiment with multiple decks, toy with the idea of permadeath, and completely mess with structure, replacing multiple isolated bouts with a single unbroken real-time match. And let me tell you, I've never seen a deck builder like Inscryption. Not because this game has any mechanical masterstroke one can point to, though it does have some very neat ideas, but because Inscryption's interests lie in entirely different places than most deck building games. Most deck builders tend to be mechanically rigorous thought exercises first and foremost, but Inscryption's priorities are on everything else around the mechanics. The aesthetics, the story, the themes, and the result is the first deck builder I've ever played that I can actually, genuinely describe as a horror game. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're wandering through dark forests in Inscryption. So okay, I just got done with my big rant about how cool deck builders are, but the half of the equation that I haven't gushed about yet is Inscryption's creator, Daniel Mullins. Deck builders are a wildly creative genre that are constantly reinventing themselves and never let any genre conceit, no matter how simple or fundamental, go unexamined. And Mullins specializes in doing exactly that, in taking all the base conceits of a genre and running them through multiple layers of meta-commentary and trope subversion until he's created something wildly unique and almost unrecognizable from the genre it came from. Deck builders as a genre are a wonderful match for Mullins' style, and Inscryption specifically is an extremely on-brand Mullins game. Not only are these two things I really like separately, but together, they are a match made in heaven. But then, on top of all of that, I found out that Inscryption is also a deck builder with a linear narrative and a definitive endpoint that can still hit all those same buttons as its roguelike brethren, while also releasing me within a dozen hours. And here at First 5, taking a normally long-winded genre and distilling its best aspects into a more digestible package is about the #1 way you can get me to care about a game. All of which is to say, this is my jam! So, what did Mullins decide to make? You've already gotten to see a few minutes of it by now and have probably come to these conclusions yourself, but Inscryption's aesthetics are fucking baller. This game locks you in a random cabin in the woods across from the world's spookiest shadow-cloaked dungeon master, and the grim creepiness only ramps up from there, both on and off the table. Teeth for keeping track of score, cannibals around the fire wanting to eat your cards, and some surprisingly unsettling bosses. Your Dungeon Master opponent loves to lay the horror elements on thick, both in his setting that you're forced to march through and with his constant descriptions of your surroundings. This game is immediately arresting just on its atmosphere alone. And the horror only expands when you realize that the faceless player holding your cards is an actual person. Inscryption goes to great pains to make its card game as diegetic as possible with this whole camera system that only lets you look at one part of the board at a time. If you're inspecting the board state but you want to look at your hand, you physically have to look down. Normally in other deck builders, you're the invisible, non-diegetic hand of God pushing around a thinly believable bundle of functions. Here, however, you're a very concrete person playing a game. And the distinction does actually matter, because the cost of failure for your would-be card slinger is death. The grim trappings extend to the gameplay as well. See, Inscryption has you building your deck out of various forest creatures. You know, rabbits, elk, wolves, Bigfoot, the Mothman. Stuff you just find in the forest. But the game's got a sort of horror-themed Yu-Gi-Oh! Twist. In order to play stronger cards, you have to pay in blood. To play a wolf, for example, you have to sacrifice 2 of your already played creatures, and this is complicated by the fact that your cards are also people. And they have some pretty obvious and understandable opinions about going under the knife. So yeah, it's all quite dark and fits right in with the cannibals and the death games and so on. The whole game is powered by some real Saw shit. But mechanically, the coolest wrinkle of this setup is Inscryption's 2-deck system. You can either draw from your personal deck of handpicked cards, or you can take a squirrel, which is basically free sacrifice fodder. But critically, you cannot draw both at once. This requires a lot of advanced strategic thinking. Your opening hand is drastically more important than it is in most other deck builders, and keeping yourself running after you've blown through that hand requires planning ahead multiple turns or winning really fast before that becomes a problem. Either strategy works, but both have to compete with a dungeon master that isn't fettered by the same restrictions and can whip up a terrifying board state incredibly quickly. Inscryption's draw system makes gathering power a glacial process, and so you need to make everything you use punch above its weight, either through sound tactics on the board or clever decisions in building your deck before you get there. This also means that in order to match that pace and not turn into a game of rocket tag, Inscryption is an extremely low-powered game compared to other deck builders. You're never going to build an infinite draw machine that runs through a whole pile of 30 cards every turn. At best, you'll probably play about 6 meaningful cards total in a single match, and every single one of them will swing the balance of the game wildly one way or the other because you only have 5 health, and you're only playing a single meaningful card every 2 or 3 turns. And this ethos extends to every other part of the game. A card that does 3 damage might sound underwhelming out of context, but here it's a high-powered wrecking machine that not a whole lot can stand up to. And if you give that card the buff that lets it attack 3 times, it can straight up just win you the game in a single turn. And that's the flip side of Inscryption's low-powered ethos. The second you do figure out how to break outside of the game's kiddie pool, there's not really anything it can do to stop you. There are cards that break the game all on their own with only the barest of buffs or combos, and even as you get used to the game, it keeps handing you more and more boons that make it kind of difficult to actually lose. But before you think I'm complaining, this all feels like it's on purpose. Once you get a win or 2 under your belt, you can literally chug through a full match in 30 minutes flat, and unlike most deck builders, Inscryption has no ascension system or similar method of ramping up with you. This game's not a tough nut to crack. But this is a Daniel Mullins game, and that's all just part of the meta commentary. I've already shown off a few of the weird things happening in the background of Inscryption, but that's only scratching the surface. So everything we've just talked about, the entire card game half of this, is a diegetic game you are playing inside of an entirely different game. At any point in between battles, you can stand up, walk around, and solve a bunch of random escape room puzzles as you try to figure out how to escape. And every time you think you've reached the end of that road, Inscryption peels back to reveal another layer. Another game outside the game, outside the game, outside the game. I mentioned that Inscryption is a linear game with a finite end unlike its deck-building peers, and all these meta layers are where that narrative comes in. Inscryption is a game that's trying to make a point, and discussing that point in any detail would involve spoiling a vast number of details about the game that it's better to not know going in. But hey, for $5 on Patreon, you can look forward to an article or 2 that'll talk about that when the reading list comes out. Hashtag become a patron today. So we're not going to peel back that narrative onion. I'll allow you the joy of doing that yourself. Instead, let's get to asking the big question. What do you get out of 5 hours with Inscryption? And it turns out the answer can actually vary a little bit. If you pick up on the right clues, 5 hours is more than enough to get through everything I just described and start diving into the really meta stuff I've been holding back. If you're like me, however, you can end up looping through the game's roguelike deck-building battles over and over, plowing mercilessly through the game on the table while entirely oblivious to the larger meta-narrative outside of it. There are a few breakpoints in this game where you can just get stuck spinning your wheels, and if you haven't made any real progress in a few hours, I recommend you hit up a walkthrough. You're missing something. But all of that said, Inscryption is still fun enough moment to moment that I didn't particularly mind dawdling for a few extra hours. While it's purposely designed with looser balance and relatively easy to conquer, finding ways to break the game over your knee is one of the primary joys of a deck builder. So this really isn't even a point against it. On the contrary, if you haven't played a deck builder before, this might give you a really accessible taste of what the genre is all about. But that's not necessarily what Inscryption is about. While I personally really enjoyed the gameplay, the main draws here are that meta-narrative I've been so coy about, and that impeccable aesthetic. Inscryption is a game with a really strong and compelling start thanks to those two elements, and even if you don't get further in, those first few hours where you're still trying to get your bearings are worth experiencing alone. It's a great little time, and you should check it out. Hey, by the way, I've got a Patreon. If you enjoyed the video enough to get all the way here, you should go throw money at it. But thank you for watching all the way through. I hope you enjoyed this review of Inscryption, and I'll see you all next time.